It's great to be back with you all. I told the people in the 9 o'clock service, you just can't get rid of me. So I hope we can have a good time this morning. Thank you to Pastor Randy, Pastor Caleb for giving me another opportunity to preach, to share something I'm learning. And so I hope that we can all learn from it this morning. Well, if you remember last summer, the last message I preached was from Judges. And I preached on Gideon, and we talked about how Gideon was given an opportunity to serve the Lord, to be willing to be a part of ministry, to be a leader. So what we're actually going to do this morning is we're going to look at the second part of that story, okay? So I know you've been waiting for almost a year to finish the series, but we'll do that this morning, okay? So if you want to go to Judges chapter 6, we're going to start later towards the end of the chapter in verse 24, I believe. But before we do that, while you're turning, while I was studying, I found something very interesting, a story that includes what I guess is called an ultra marathon. And these ultra marathons are these long races that I guess whoever runs it can kind of determine what it is, what it includes, what the distance is. And what was interesting to me, that this ultra marathon, the specific one, is run in Australia between Sydney and Melbourne. Now, I didn't know the distance between those, so I had to go and I had to look. And the exact distance of this race is about 544 miles. Okay, and this race is not done in cars or bikes. They actually run. They actually run this race. All right, it's a marathon anyway. All right, so they begin the training and all this stuff. This is a very long race. And on the day of the beginning of this race, the 6 racers that had been training for a long time to do this race get up to the start line, and they find that they have a 7th competitor. Now, this individual, his name is Cliff Young. Cliff Young was a 61-year-old sheep farmer. And Cliff shows up to the race in his overalls and his work boots. He tells media that before he feels like he's qualified to run this race because he's previously spent about 2 days running after his sheep. And so he believes that he can do this race. So the start gun goes off and the runners take off. And within half an hour, it's pretty obvious that Cliff is probably not going to win this race. The group of runners was way off in the distance, and Cliff is just kind of shuffling along. I think they believe they later named it the Young Shuffle. And so as he lopes along at this pace, he just keeps going. And as the other competitors, they stop for the night. The way to run this race was that you just run for a day, you stop, you sleep for 6 hours, get up the next morning, and keep running. But Cliff didn't do that. He just kept going. And within 5 days and 4 hours and some odd minutes, Cliff had crossed the finish line about 10 hours before the next runner. All the rest of the runners, all 6 of them beat the previous record. And he beat all of them by 10 hours. Which is very interesting to me. I mean, he never took off his work boots or his overalls. He finished the race like that. And he told media after he was done, he said, sometimes it got really hard, and I just imagined that I was running after my sheep. I just imagined that I was going after them. And to me, looking at this story, it was very interesting because this guy never gave up. Mr. Cliff had all the reason in the world to be like, all right, I did my job. I ran for 2 days straight. I'm good. He had all the excuses in the world. But did he take them? No, he didn't. He didn't take any excuses. He just kept going. Even when the strength might have failed him, he just kept going. And hearing that story to me never gets old. Because it makes me wonder, what would happen if we never stopped trusting God? What would happen if we decided that we could trust God and never stop? It could make us great Christian warriors. It could make us so that we could handle anything that came our way because we were trusting on God's strength and God's power. Just like Mr. Young never quit running, I believe that we can never quit trusting God and in God's strength. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. Sadly, I kind of believe that something that Gideon says here in this passage is probably an echo of what a lot of us, including myself, say in our brains. If you look in verse 17, a little higher than when I said we were going to start. Verse 17 says that this is Gideon talking to God. He said unto him, "If now I have found grace in thy sight, then show me a sign that thou talkest to me." And sadly, that's a lot of what we look for. We look for signs. We look for ways that God's going to prove himself that he's real, that he's going to be in our lives. And I don't say that there's anything wrong with that. But we're going to look here and see that Gideon asks for a lot of signs. And we're going to explore the different, some specifically two different experiences that he has, and look at how did Gideon approach these tasks that God gave him? How did Gideon approach the jobs that he had, the tasks that he had, the Christian life? Okay, so we're going to start in verse 24. You can read along with me as I read. We're going to start in verse 24 of Judges chapter 6. It says this: "Then Gideon built an altar there unto the Lord, and called it Jehovah Shalom. Unto this day it is yet in Ophrah of the Bezrites. And it came to pass the same night, the Lord said unto him, Take thy father's young bullock, even the second bullock of 7 years old, and throw down the altar of Baal that thy father hath, and cut down the grove that is by it. And build an altar unto the Lord thy God upon the top of this rock in the ordered place. And take the second bullock and offer a burnt sacrifice with the wood of the grove which thou shalt cut down. Then Gideon took 10 men of his servants, and did as the Lord said unto him. And so it was, because he feared his father's household and the men of the city, that he could not do it by day, that he did it by night. And when the men of the city arose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was cast down, and the grove was cut down that was by it. And the second bullock was offered upon the altar that was built. And they said one to another, Who hath done this thing? And they inquired and asked, and they said, Gideon, the son of Joash, hath done this thing. Then the men of the city said unto Joash, Bring out thy son, that he may die, because he hath cast down the altar of Baal, because he hath cut down the grove that was by it. And Joash said unto all that stood against him, Will ye plead for Baal? Will ye save him? He that will plead for him, let him be put to death. Whilst it is yet morning, if he be a god, let him plead for himself, because one hath cast down his altar. Therefore on that day they called him Jerubbaal, saying, Let Baal plead against him, because he hath thrown down his altar. And we're going to stop there. We'll go farther in the story as we go through some of these lessons. But I wanted to look at this second part of Gideon's story, because I think there's a lot to learn from his actions and his reactions. Here we see Gideon given a task. Now this is part of the task that we touched on in my last message about Gideon. But Gideon is given this task to go and chop down the main worship center for this town. If we were paying attention, we noticed that it actually belongs to his father. So it's an altar, and it's a grove of trees that makes this place kind of sacred to those who worship this God. And Gideon is given the task to go and destroy it. Now, I don't know about you, but I do kind of enjoy destroying things sometimes, if we're doing like remodeling or things like that. So I'm sure maybe that part of it was fun to him. But we notice in verse 27, at the end of the verse, he says that he could not do it by day. I'm sorry. Let's go a little bit farther in the front. He says, So it was because he feared his father's household and the men of the city that he could not do it by day, but that he did it by night. So he's scared of the reaction of the people that in this town, the people that use the altar and the grove of trees. But I believe that in this situation, even though the task looked challenging and scary, Gideon's reaction was not to trust God. Gideon's reaction was, okay, how can I do this the best way? So what he does is he grabs 10 of his father's servants. I feel bad for those guys because they didn't really have a choice. They just had to follow Gideon. But he grabs 10 of his father's servants, and they follow him, and they go to do the destruction that God had asked him to do. And he also does it at night. Now, the command doesn't specifically say that he was supposed to do it in the daytime, okay? So I think it's very interesting that they pointed out that he had to do it at night. But to me, pulling down big stones, chopping down trees isn't exactly a silent operation. So I'm not really sure what the cover of night was going to do for him, because I'm sure he had to have lights. There was probably cows and oxen making noise, and he was pulling down big stones and chopping down trees. So there's probably a lot of noise. So I'm not really sure how he thought he was going to get away with this without people knowing that he did it. But he does his chopping, he does his destruction, and he follows God's commands to the T. He destroys everything. He rebuilds the altar of God and sacrifices the bullock on top, just like God had asked him to do. But the problem here is that he did it on his own. He decided that he was going to try to do this in his own power, in his own ingenuity. He trying to sneak around and do it so that nobody would notice. And obviously it gets him in trouble here. But if we look in verses 28 through 32, mostly actually 30 through 32, we find that Joash, which is Gideon's father, also the owner of this grove that Gideon just destroyed. We would have thought that Joash would have been one of the biggest protagonists against him. He would have been one of the biggest people trying to get Gideon to be punished for this action. But actually, he defends Gideon. He looks at these guys and he tells them, what are you guys doing here? If you guys actually think that Baal is a god, then you should be letting him handle this. I find that fascinating. This means that God had worked in Joash's life and used him to protect Gideon, to protect God's servant in this action. Even though Gideon hadn't really done it the exact way that God would have liked to see him do it, God was still protecting him. God was still using him in this circumstance. I find that very, very encouraging. Because even though Gideon maybe not had done it the exact right way, maybe he didn't follow the exact right way of doing it through God's strength and letting God have the credit for it, he still accomplishes the task, and God still finds glory through the saving of his servant. Now, one of the things that I find is that Gideon kind of chose to kind of trust himself in this scenario. We find a couple different examples of ways that God protects his servant when they choose to follow him. One of them I see is Daniel. In the book of Daniel, in the first chapter, you don't have to turn there, but in Daniel, we meet this teenager who is actually stolen away from his family, stolen away from the culture that he knows, all of his friends, his church, his school, everything, and he's put in a completely different area. But yet, even after all of that, he doesn't sit in a corner and pout and ask God why. He's still sold out to trusting God. We find throughout the rest of his story, in chapter 1, verse 8, we find that he purposes in his heart that he's not going to defile himself. No matter what happens, he was going to put God first in his life. It didn't matter. And God uses Daniel as he progresses through his life, through the dreams, through the statues, the idols, everything that he faces, even up to the lion's den. God works through Daniel's life, even through all of those circumstances. Another one I would throw out there is Solomon. And you might be like, well, Solomon disobeyed God. He was a nasty king. Well, actually, in the beginning of his life, as a young king, Solomon was approached by God, and he was given a choice. God says, Solomon, I'm going to give you whatever you want. All you have to do is choose. Solomon could have asked for a large army. He could have asked for lots of money. He could have asked for a ton of things, but he chose wisdom. He chose a relationship with God, is what he chose, because he understood that he needed God's power in his life. He could not be a good ruler without God's power in his life. I think it's high time for us to realize that we cannot be good Christians, we cannot be successful Christians if we don't ask God to be in our lives, to be involved in our life, to have his strength flow through our life. And we find Gideon learning this as as he goes through the experiences of his life. And if we look farther down in this passage, we find in verses 36 through 40 that he has another experience with God, asking him to do things. And in those a couple verses between, we find that the Midianites and the Amalekites have gathered in the valley. They have their massive army. But one of my favorite verses is verse 34. If you want to look there with me, it says this: "But the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew the trumpet, and Abiezer was gathered to him after him." It says, "But the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon." Gideon was afraid. We've seen that all throughout this chapter. Gideon was afraid. He didn't know what to do. He's following God's commands. And in this verse, it says that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon. But even after that, he still struggles. We're going to read verses 36 down through verse 40. You can follow along with me as I read. Verse 36. "And Gideon said unto God, If thou wilt save Israel by mine hand, as thou hast said, behold, I will put a fleece of wool in the floor, and if the dew be on the fleece only, and it be dry upon all the earth beside, then shall I know that thou wilt save Israel by mine hand, as thou hast said. And it was so. For he rose up early on the morrow, and thrust the fleece together, and wringed the dew out of the fleece, a bowl full of water. And Gideon said unto God, Let not thine anger be hot against me. I will speak but this once. Let me prove, I pray thee, but this once with the fleece. Let it now be dry only upon the fleece, and upon all the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night, for it was dry upon the fleece only, and there was dew on all the ground." Now, something in this experience that I find very funny is the progression that Gideon has with this fleece. I'm sure I'm not exactly sure why he thought this was the hardest thing ever for God to do. But apparently he believes that that's so, okay? And I'm not exactly sure why he thought that making the fleece only wet and the ground dry was not as hard as making all the ground dry and the fleece, all the ground wet and the fleece dry. But he follows that progression, and the most fascinating thing that I find in this story is that even though we know for sure that Gideon is not trusting God at this point, Gideon is not following God's strength. He's not allowing God's strength. He's scared out of his mind. And God could have said, Gideon, you've tested me way too much. Just go do it. But he still gives him those signs. He still gives him the things that Gideon asks for. He still says, you know what, you can have those signs, because he wants Gideon to trust him. And the encouragement that I find from this is that even though we make mistakes, even though we may not trust God as much as God asks of us, he's still going to give us chances. He still loves us. He still wants to use us. He still wants to be a blessing to people through our lives. But we have to let him. We have to let him work through us. It's interesting to me how Gideon laid out the guidelines for how he was going to serve God. And he said, God, yeah, sure, I'll do that, but first, this. We look through this entire story, these chapters. We find so many different ways that Gideon asks for signs. He asks for assurances of all these different things concerning God. In the next chapter, in chapter 7, we see Gideon is still afraid. After all of these signs, after all of these things that God has done for him, he's still scared. And rightly so. He's facing a massive army. But God actually sends him down into the camp of the Midianites and the Amalekites. And he listens to a soldier sharing a dream that he has. And in this dream of a rock attacking the camp and destroying everything, the soldier actually names Gideon and says that was the rock's name. And even through that, finally, Gideon says, all right, God, I can trust you. And so Gideon goes out and his army of 300 men wins this victory that no one could ever say was accredited to Gideon or any of his men. This victory was so clear and obviously a victory that God won. So we wonder what it would be like to have God work in our lives that same way. To see God work in our lives in a way that it's so clear and so obvious that it's His power going through our lives, not our own. And that's what Gideon had to realize. It wasn't about him. It wasn't about what he could do. It wasn't about his prowess as a military leader. It was about Gideon opening himself up and being willing to let God work through him. To be a humble servant. And that's what it's about for us. It's about looking up and asking God to work through our lives. Not trying to accomplish the Christian life on our own, in our own power. It's letting God work through us. Now, last summer, during the pandemic, one of the youth activities that we did was we did hikes in the early morning up Candy Mountain. And the little hill over here. And so one morning, we had done the hike and came back, and I came to church to do work, and we finished work, and I was, I think I should do something active. Okay, maybe I should go on a run. And so I was thinking about where I should run, and on the hike, we had seen people running up Candy Mountain and coming back. I don't know if some of you do that or not. If you do, I have very much respect for you. But so I was deciding, that might be a good thing. Now, I will tell you, I am not a runner. Okay, I play sports. Okay, I mostly play soccer and basketball. Well, some of you saw how I play basketball, but soccer, football, those kind of things are a little bit more better than basketball. But I kind of go with something that a pastor friend once told me, is that the wicked flee when no man pursueth. So I just generally don't run a lot, but I decided that I was going to do it. Okay, I was going to try to run. So I drove over there. I got to the trailhead, and I just started running. I ran up the gravel paths up there, and it's just kind of a slight incline up to where the hill actually starts. And when I got to where it actually starts going up, I was dead tired. I couldn't run anymore. It's not even a mile. I don't know what's going on, but I couldn't go any farther. So I started walking. And all these people are passing me, and I'm like, I'm supposed to be running, like I have all the cool stuff on, and I can't run. And so I started running again about halfway up, and I got the rest of the way up. By the time I got to the top, I was exhausted. I had to walk the last couple of feet. I got to the top, and I couldn't breathe. I couldn't do it. And I think a lot of times, in our lives, we are trying to be like me trying to run up Candy Mountain. We are trying to use our own power to attain things that we can't actually get to. Now, the illustration does fall apart because if I tried to do it more than I probably could. But at that point, in that physical condition, I could not run up Candy Mountain. In our human condition, we cannot accomplish the task, accomplish the Christian life in our own power. It's impossible. But we have God on our side. We have God's power. He wants to work through us. He wants to prove himself to us. He wants to use us to work in people's lives around us. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like me trusting God. Us giving our faith, saying, God, I'm going to trust you no matter what. Hebrews 11:1 says this, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Gideon's focus throughout this entire event was solely on what he could do, on what he couldn't do, really. Being scared because he knew that he humanly couldn't do it. And he could not get past that fact. But I wonder what would have happened if Gideon had been just said, you know what, God, I'm going to let you work through me. But you know what, at the same time, I'm kind of glad that he didn't, because now we have this story. We have this story that tells us of the different ways that God wants to work through our lives. We have so many different stories in this book that tell us how God has worked in the lives of people before us. Not just those who just immediately trusted him, but also those who made mistakes. Those who slipped up, those who tried to do it on their own. They weren't thrown to the side. God still wanted to use them. God still loved them. God still loves us. And that's the truth that I've taken from this, is that even though I've made so many mistakes, even though there's been so many times where I've tried to accomplish God's will on my own, God still wants to use me. He still wants to use us. He wants to work through us to accomplish his will. And that's the great fact. So I want to leave you with this. The thoughts that we have and the actions that we choose to take reveal the level of our faith in God. I'll say that again. The thoughts that we have and the actions that we choose to take reveal the level of our faith in God. Now, I'm not going to tell you that you have to rate your faith. We're not doing that. We're not here to have a competition. But we are here to look for ways that we can grow in our relationship with God. We are here to encourage one another, to help each other grow in our relationships with God, in our level of faith, and how much we trust him. And we open up our lives and say, you know what, God, this is all about you and not about me at all. It's about being an open pipe that he can work through us, not a clogged one. So as we close this morning, I wonder, when's the last time that you were able to say, yes, Lord, I'm truly open to you. Please work through me. When's the last time that we said that we were completely open, completely sold out to Christ, holding nothing back? I can tell you for myself, it's been a while. This has been a huge challenge to me, and I hope it is to you. That as we close this morning, we're looking for those areas that we can give up, that it's no longer about how we accomplish tasks for God. It's about how God lives that Christian life through us. Let's bow for prayer. Lord, I thank you for this challenge. I thank you for this lesson that you have helped us to learn through the life of Gideon, through the lives of all of those biblical heroes that, yes, they made mistakes, but you still loved them and you still love us, and you want to work through our lives. Lord, help us to be willing and able to let you work through our life, that we can see the ministry, the power, the strength that you can have through our life and see the things that we can accomplish through that. I thank you for your love for us. I thank you that you don't cast us aside when we make mistakes. And I thank you for the fact that we can have that opportunity to grow in our relationship with you, that we can sell ourselves out to you completely and fully, and that you work through our lives.